I'm like super dumb. I just about did the whole thing again. So this is the vehicle of change we're talking about. And I'm very unhappy because I forgot to turn my microphone on and I almost did it again just now. Can you believe it? Oh, hours that I spent. Well, no, I didn't spend hours doing the presentation, but hours of the upload and oh. Anyway, I'm trying to do this the best I possibly can and routinely doing a pretty bad job of it. Thank you very much, okay? So, with the whole issue, of course, is the triumph of the modern, all these manifestations of modernization that are occurring in terms of the United States during the 1920s. I told you one of the big developments is the emergence of the vehicle of change. It's the automobile. And we can see, of course, just the numbers, suggestive of the rise of the automobile in terms of its just appearance. One of them back in 1896, of course, 8,000 by the turn of the century, 8 million by 1920, 28 million by the time we get to 1930. Of course, the car is just coming into play like it's going out of style. Of course, the huge impacts upon America. And the great car of the era, of course, was the Model T. The Model T is as quainted as it is. It is the greatest car, one of the greatest cars. It is the first great car for sure, but one of the greatest cars in the history of the automobile. There are stories associated with the Model T, and I told you about Henry Ford. I wanted to mention the fact that he has this genius, of course, there's no doubt about that, in terms of the car, in terms of production technologies, in terms of labor relations, but also the madness of this man, the way he treated his son, of course, the way he ultimately would treat his company, his increased sort of paranoia, his anti-Semitism. All these things are problematic components as far as Henry Ford is concerned. Well, another big story, of course, is the story of the Ford Motor Company. And the Ford Motor Company began in 1903. I'm going to write a little bit on the board here. I hope it works out for okay for you guys. 1903. And the main thing I'm interested in is the original capitalization. So that means, how much money was put into this. And then we get to see what happens to that. Henry Ford wanted to build a company, of course, to build automobiles. He puts it together in 1903. He had to scrimp for every single dime he could put into this thing. He mortgaged his farm, put all his money into it, but he really didn't have enough. So he had to go to everyone he knew, all the local people, the banks, his friends, family, and beg essentially to them to help them to support this effort. And they ultimately will put together about $250,000. And I do want you to know that this I've seen a lot of different the range could be somewhere from 250,000, probably somewhat less than that too, about that particular amount of money. So the initial capitalization, and a critical feature of the story was that Henry Ford was a minor investor in his own company. It's got his name on it, but he was a minor investor. So he had a board, and chairman of the board and others that kind of were in control because it was their money. And they kind of told him what to do in the very beginning, and it's going to take him a while to wrest control of the company from them. And that's, a foundation, kind of what will lead us ultimately to the Model T. But here's what I want to do with you guys. So 1903, we're looking at the Ford Motor Company coming into play, of course, in an industry that's kind of non-existent in many ways. By the time we get to 1930, so as we approach the end of the 1920s, I just want you to know what I want to ask. I want you to guess. I'd love you to guess what the value of the Ford Motor Company was by 1930. And of course, do a wild guess before I tell you just, what do you think, what do you think, what do you think? By 1930, the value of the Ford Motor Company was, oops, wrong one, $600 million. So you just see this extraordinary, increase in relative value. Indeed, the Ford Motor Company in 1930 was the most valuable company, the largest company in the entire world, the most valuable company in the entire world. So, there really wasn't an automobile industry in 1900, and yet, the automobile industry is the largest industry in the world by 1930, and Henry Ford had the largest company, of course, in this emerging industry. So just, incredible value increase of this, Ford would have been the Apple of its moment, of course, the most valuable company, unless that's Amazon today. I don't know which company is the most valuable. Anyway, I'd just like to tell you little anecdotes associated with this. So Ford had an aunt, and he went to everyone he could to try to get money in for investment. And he asked the aunt, and the aunt invested $2,500. Well, that aunt sold her shares in 1930, and she sold them for, you want to guess? She sold them for $32 million. And that doesn't count the $6 million that she had made in dividends over the course. She made $38 million off of her initial investment. And kind of suggest you that if you ever know someone who's got a good idea, maybe invest a little money in them. You know, would it be so cool to be on the ground floor of something that went really, really big? Anyway, the Ford Motor Company, of course, becomes part of the story, no doubt, and the Ford Motor Company continues to this day. It's one of the major global automakers at this moment. All right. Now, the ultimate story, really, though, is the story of the car itself. So, the Model T. You know, if you did the identification, Henry Ford is one line, the company is another line, but the real essence of the identification, of course, is the Model T. Now, when we see Model Ts, I got to tell you, I am kind of obsessed with them. Every time I get close to a Model T, I'm really excited. Every chance I've got to ever get riding a Model T, I've taken. Well, I've never ridden in one, but I've sat in them a couple of times. But let me put that together, you know, so you guys can see it. Here is my Chris Johnson's funky visuals. This is a classic Model T right here, okay? But if you look at it, it does look so quaint. There's no doubt about that. It's got a quaintness to it. It kind of it takes you back to the old carriages, of course, in the basic framework of the whole thing. Had a wooden dashboard in the same way that you would have had a dashboard in a carriage. In the beginning, they had carriage lights on the side. There were no headlights. They just had carriage. I think this one actually has the carriage lights. I don't know if you can just see them right there on the right there. Those are the carriage lights that would have been there. Anyway, wooden spoke wheels. You know, the wheels were wooden, the spokes were wooden, basically. All these things that very much harken us back to, of course, the horse and buggy days one way or the other. So, you know, it does seem to be extraordinarily quaint. But you need to know, this was state of the art. This car was state of the art, and Henry Ford, you know, put all of this incredible technology into it. It was made from a German steel that was lightweight and stronger than other steels that would have been available. It had by far the most efficient engine of any automobile engine at that time. If you go back to that era, they would make these monster engines, like 400 cubic inch displacement, and yet they were so inefficient. They'd create like 10 horsepower or something like that. And here Henry Ford came up with a four-banger, four-cylinder engine that was a very effective engine. 4 cylinders. It had 4 batteries. I always think that's interesting. 1 battery for each cylinder, which I think did allow you to actually have like 1 battery run down and continue to run the car. I've always wondered, like, if 2 batteries went down, could you still run on 2 cylinders? If 3 batteries, you know, could you run on, you know, that would have been just crazy. Just a little bit of power, of course, and a whole bunch of smoke going out the rear end. But it was really state of the art in terms of, you know, the construction of it. I do want you to know that, you know, it's distinct from the cars that we drive today. None of us can just hop into a Model T and drive away if we wanted to. It had a hand crank, of course. You know, they would ultimately put a start in, but a hand crank. Those cranks were kind of notorious for a kickback, and they could actually break people's wrist when they were cranking them up. It didn't have a gas pedal. It had a throttle and a spark. And these were on the column, so as you are accelerating, you're pushing both the throttle, that gives it more gas, and the spark, which fires the cylinders a little more rapidly. There were 3 pedals on the ground, and you know, none of them were exactly what you and I would think they would be. One of them was sort of the gear pedal, and there were 4 locations on the pedal. There was a neutral location, there was a reverse location, there were 2 forward gears, so it had 2 gears to go forward, basically. Had a planetary clutch. I'm not exactly sure what that means. The brakes were like a squeezing of the freewheel. The freewheel was a big round thing, and the brakes were leather bands that would squeeze the freewheel to get it to stop. I have a sense that, you know, I've heard this, that they were difficult to stop, and that was kind of a scary component of the whole thing. Anyway, you know, they aren't something you and I can jump into and just drive if we wanted to. You know, it's this first attempt to kind of put this all together. Now, as you can imagine, even though it was state of the art, of course, critical design flaws in a number of ways. They had high ground clearance, and the reason for that was just because they needed it. It's a time when it's mostly dirt roads, essentially. So you had to be able to. I saw some of the movies that were like the commercials for this, you know, that they for selling the vehicle, and they show off in the vehicle off road and going up and down. You know, mostly down things, of course, that are difficult. But going up something would be a little bit different. But they wanted to have high ground clearance. But the problem with that is, of course, it made the vehicle very tippy. And if you crank that steering wheel too much, I mean, you could flip that sucker in a heartbeat. They called them Tin Lizzies because a lot of people began to die in those cars. You know, they were falling out of the cars one way or the other. Anyway, Lizzie Borden was a woman who hacked her mother and father to death. So Tin Lizzie meant something that was a kind of murderous in its nature. But there was a design flaw in terms of just the height of the whole thing. They also they made a little problem. They put the gas tank underneath the seat. And then the gas tank had a gravity flow that went down to the engine. And of course, gravity flow is fine as long as the gravity is flowing the way you want it to go. but they found out very quickly that if you took a Model T and you went uphill, you lost you lost your fuel flow. So they had to adjust to this as quickly as they could. So one thing they would do is they would get to the bottom of a steep hill, and they knew it wouldn't make it up that hill, of course, that you lose your fuel flow. They would turn the vehicle around and they would back up the hill. And I remember seeing a photograph of the road highway going up to Big Bear, and both cars on the roadway are pointed downhill, and so it looks like two lanes of people coming down. But if you can't see it in the picture, but if you look closely, this side is going uphill backwards, and the other side is coming downhill, of course, forwards. And when they did that, of course, it stopped some of the airflow through the radiator, and they often would overheat. Had a lot of little issues like that where they became part of it. But relatively lightweight, two men could lift the rear end, and of course, because of the lightweight nature, especially for like the two-seat runabouts, these were just relatively small cars. They'd play tricks on, they would, big strong men would move them someplace or put it on top of that just as a kind of a joke to punk somebody. They were relatively easy to maintain. It was stated that when you had a Model T, what you needed, of course, was a screwdriver, a wrench, a pair of pliers, and a hammer. And the joke was the hammer was just a beat on it when you got mad. But they were kind of like old Harley Davidsons. They would rattle themselves, kind of apart. So you periodically had to stop and tighten everything down and make sure that it was still pretty functional. But anyway, they came up with a car that was going to be ultimately the car for every person. Now, one of the critical factors of the Model T was the issue of price. So in the very beginning, 1908 was the beginning year of the Model T. If I didn't tell you that, I'm really sorry. It is 1908 when it all started. Henry Ford finally gained control of his company. The company starts 1903. He gains control of the company about 1908. The cost of the Model T at that time was $780, and that actually was very expensive. And that actually was beyond the ken, the abilities of most Americans. And Henry Ford knew that, and he wanted this to be the car for every man. So he did everything he could with every kind of economy of scale you can possibly